In 2006, when I had a research consultancy in Scotland, I was hired by the Carnegie UK Rural Commission, which is a charity fund for, well, in this case it is for rural development. Andrew Carnegie was, at one time, he was a Scot who became the richest man in the world in New York City through steel and coal industries. And Carnegie was an interesting man because he knew that he couldn't take his wealth with him when he died. And so he gave his money away to create something called the Carnegie Foundation, which was funded with $400 million. And so the money that earned, the interest that earned, is what is now called the Carnegie Foundation. And the Carnegie Foundation did everything from build libraries in little towns all across America to improve literacy and knowledge. They invested in all sorts of things to improve public life. So in 2006, I was approached by this UK Carnegie Commission. And their goal was vital rural communities. And their goal was to empower people to take control of their own lives, their own economy. And so they asked me to build a model of asset-based rural community development. And what we have now is, in a sense, the result of that. Now what's interesting is, you remember I said earlier, that if you're an academic, you come up with ideas that get associated with your name. I never published seriously this asset-based model. So my name is not associated with it, which is very interesting. Because the word now, community assets, is used universally in rural development in the UK. And it's kind of nice to know that is there. On the other hand, of course, I would have been a professor 5 years ago. I would have had my name put beside it, but never mind. So I'm going to start with this. What do we need for development? Well, we need imagination. If we're thinking about innovation. We need a creativity. We need to be prepared to work really bloody hard. If you work for yourself, you always work harder than if you work for somebody else, after all. As a research consultant, I was my own marketer, I was my own accounting department, I was my own workforce, I was my own publicity. I had to do everything. That's what it's like when you have your own business. When I worked at the university, I could say to the administration, you do the economics. You find the students. When you work for yourself, you have to make sure you do all of it. So we need enterprise, we need imagination, we need creativity, but most of all, we need something to develop. What is that going to be? Well, the first question you have to ask is, what do I already have? What do I have? What is my assets for development? Another important question is, how do we make development sustainable? Now, sustainability is usually seen as being environmental. It's about the environment, it's about biodiversity and not poisoning the land. But this idea of sustainability actually goes much, much further than that. And they often talk about the sustainability triangle, which I'll come to. But the point of it is that there's a tension around this issue of sustainability. Because the world is always changing. So how the heck are you going to have something keep going and stay the same? You can't. The only way you can stay the same is by changing. So how do we do that? How do we bring that in, And particularly this is because, for example, outside, top-down development usually lasts as long as an external funder is giving money to the community. And when the money stops, very often the development stops. And I'm going to talk about how this works practically in a little bit. What do we mean by sustainable development? We mean that the development keeps going in the community. It doesn't stop when the people with the big pockets go away. It means that the benefits of development are available to our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. And not only that, it means that the benefits are enjoyed by the people in the community. In Norway, in the fjords, we get 50 cruise ships a year come in full of tourists. And you get these wonderful pictures of these giant cruise ships in these fjords parked outside these little communities with 300 houses. You know, and there's 3,000 people on the boat. That's tourism, right? Wait, is it sustainable tourism? Do the people in those houses make any money from those cruise boats? You know, the people on the cruise boats eat on the cruise boats. They pay, I mean, one of the main things about taking a cruise is you pay a single lump sum and you don't have to pay anything else. Everything's taken care of. That's how they market it. So how do we make sure that some of that money stays in the community that has the beautiful mountains and the beautiful fjords that these people have traveled all the way across the world and spent a lot of money to come and visit? How do we make sure that some of that money stays in the community where that beautiful thing is? Because if we don't, then for the community, that development is not sustainable. And what does that mean? Well, that means probably that the young people will move somewhere else where there is money. And you get the population decline, or a village where it's only old people. Sustainable development means that the benefits, some of the benefits at least, stay in that community. Now here is the sustainable development triad. Three components make something really sustainable. The environment, we shouldn't poison the environment so that our kids can't live in it or use it. It should be economically sustainable so that the economic benefits come to the people in the place, in the community, the people who are doing it. And it should also, of course, be socially sustainable. In other words, the benefits don't just come to the small elite proportion of the community, but the benefits spread throughout society. All three are necessary for real sustainability. This is the sustainability triangle. So if you're thinking about sustainable development, you have to think about, what does it do to the environment? What does it do to the society? I mean, there's so many classic cases of tourism in Africa, where the people come in from America, spend their money, and the people living in the village are still poor. Or only the headman becomes rich, and everybody else still stays poor, because the benefits don't come all the way through the whole society. So when we're thinking of sustainable development, we have to think of all three things. How do we do that? Well, I mean, this isn't rocket science. I keep saying this, but it's not. How do we make sustainable development sustainable? We get the people on the ground to do the developing, to be the developers, to start the new businesses, to take advantage of the new opportunities, to police their environment to make sure it stays okay, because they're the ones who know that environment. They're the ones who live in it. And we make sure that some economic benefit stays in that local area. By getting people to do the development, they take ownership of it. It's my development. know, those community forests in Scotland. You know, I was telling you about the kids running around like they own the place. That's because it's my community forest. Yeah? And that's really important for spirit. It's really important for identity. Who am I? Where am I from? And it's really important for keeping it going over a longer period of time. So this is a very, very fundamental principle. And it could be quite obvious, but you'd be surprised, maybe you wouldn't be surprised, at how people didn't realize this in the international development for a very long time. This principle of asset-based rural community development originally comes from the field of international development, you know, aid to the third world. And in the 1980s, the World Bank, the UN, all these international development agencies had these huge projects in Africa and South America where they spent hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars building dams, building roads, building all of this expensive infrastructure. And there was case after case where the project would get halfway finished and the money would run out. It would take longer than the 3 years of the project to actually do it. And you'd have tens of millions of dollars of expensive first world equipment sitting at the side of an unfinished road resting because it had a flat tire. And nobody could find replacement tires because they're only made in Michigan. And they don't have the money to so. And so you had development, which was not only not sustainable, it was a waste of money. And the people who lived there, what did they get? A half-built road. Did anybody ever come to those people and say, what do you need? No, of course not. Somebody in New York at the UN headquarters said, they need a road. They need a dam. I know, let's make a $350 million project and we'll build a road. And so, by the end of the 1980s in the international development field, people began to realize that this was really not the best approach, the best way to mobilize development. And people started to realize that once the developers left, local people didn't have much more than they had before they came, despite having spent $300 million. They said, oh, geez, well, you know, how can we make this development sustainable? And finally, somebody started to realize, oh, well, maybe we should involve the local people. Not come in, do something, and at the end say, okay, here you are, bye. But from the very beginning, talk to the local people and say, what's important for you? What are your priorities? How can you, be part of this development? And this asset-based model is a part of that. I don't know about you, but I keep thinking it's nighttime. Yeah. Could somebody turn a light on, please? Maybe we'll be a little bit more awake. Thank you. Yes. Why local people? Because even if local people take ownership of development, after the experts and the financiers and the evaluators and the accountants all go back to New York City, if the local people have ownership of the development, they continue to use it, they continue to develop it. It's a key realization about how to make development sustainable, is to give it to the people who actually live there. Okay, that's obvious, isn't it? But it's really funny how really, really smart people didn't see that obvious until billions of dollars were spent. There's two kinds of development. There's exogenous development and endogenous development. Both of the words, they come from the Greek, exo, from the outside, endo, from the inside. The other way to say it is top-down development or bottom-up development. And it's a bit of a truism, of course. Bottom-up development immediately sounds better than top-down. But actually, it's not a truism. If you do the research and find out it does actually work that way. So this whole presentation and this whole course is about endogenous development, about bottom-up development. Because bottom-up development is the place to start from to build sustainable development. And even in the environment, I have a project right now in Norway where I'm working with 2 plant biologists and a community outside Bergen. And the biologists are teaching the people in the community, volunteers, how to record scientific observations about the various plant species, and about alien plant species, and about water management and flood control. At the end of 2 years, those 6 volunteers will be skilled at doing that. So when we run out of money and I have to apply to do some other project, the people in that community will have the skill to be their own scientists. It's called citizen science. And it's a kind of growing field of participatory development. So even in the environmental, in terms of environmental management, this is really important. Endogenous development. So, okay, yes, great. What do local people have? I mean, I'm coming with $100 million and a whole lot of construction equipment made by Caterpillar, in Kamasu. What do these African peasants have to contribute to something like this? Well, local people do have assets to contribute. They have, for a start, the land that the development is, it's where they live, and in some cases, even if they don't own it, they possess it. Even if you can argue about property ownership, but where people live, that's their land. They have local knowledge. So, for example, if you're doing environmental management for water control, people know what happened 30 years ago. Oh, there was the flood, or drought, the opposite. But we know there's a spring here where the water always flows. Local knowledge is really important, and it's knowledge that outsiders, by definition, have. Local people have ways of working together. Oh, he's good at working with stone. She's really good at organizing people and go over at partying. Oh, that one over there is really good at organizing the money. They have a mobile phone and a bank account, They know that. Ways of working together. I was part of a project in 2002 to 2003 called The Distinctiveness of Rural Areas. It was a European-funded project, and we looked at 8 rural regions in Europe. And there were 4 pairs. And each pair had kind of similar circumstances. And one was doing very well, successful. There was a good economy, there was a lot of people on the land, there were young people. The other one was the opposite, where the economy wasn't so good, young people went away to the city. And we looked at these 4 sets of examples to see, why is this one working and this one not? Why is this one? And at the end of this long process, the main reason we could find for success was the way people worked together. So, for example, if you had a strong church community where people actually participated and helped each other through church organizations, you could come in with a development program and people were already used to working together. If you had a place where you just had sort of individual families, They didn't work together. Well, they had to build that skill of how to work together and how to cooperate and how to make it work. The major distinguishing factor in all four situations was what they call social capital. The ability of a group to create connections between themselves and between the community and outside communities. That was the main difference between these success and not so good success. The way that people work together. It's incredibly important. And of course, all this various skills and let's not forget, local people in development, they have good reason to want development to happen because they want life to be better for their kids, if not themselves. So people will do things because of that motivation. So, assets, which is what this is about today. What am I talking about? This is the Norse. Assets doesn't translate very well from English into Norwegian. Does it translate well into Czech? What word would you use for assets? Before I say that, think about this one. The word assets comes from finance. In the world of finance, an asset is something you own that you can borrow money against. A bank says, yeah, I'll loan you 100,000 euros. What are your assets? And if you don't pay me, I take your assets. That's what the original word is. What we've done here in English is we've said, actually, assets are so much more than land that you own. Assets are the necessary components of development. So, what would you say in Czech? What would be a good?
Aktiva, prostředky,
Right.
zdroje.
So are we fairly clear on that, what I'm saying? Taking this idea out of the banks and into the community, as it were? Yeah. Assets are not just things. In fact, very often things are not enough to make sustainable development. You need more than just things to make sustainable development. So, in this model, there are two types of assets. There are tangible assets and intangible assets. And once again, what is a tangible asset? Well, it's something material. It's something you can stub your toe up. Intangible assets are not material. Local knowledge, building knowledge. For example, remember I was talking in repurposing about old building techniques. Guess what? That's an asset for sustainable development. And local people, some of them may still know how to use that kind of clay in the ground right there and turn it into something that you put on the wall as a kind of plaster. And they know where to find it and how to mix it and what to do. It's that knowledge, that local knowledge, that is a key component. Also relationships and networks. And of course, financial capital. Of course, that is a part of it as well. So you have two types of assets. Tangible or material assets and intangible ones. And really, to make sustainable development, you need all of that. You need both. Yes.
Just when you were talking about community ownership, do you ever find it a problem, I found it in Scotland, the way, the sort of way people feel about community, even if it's kind of being organised by an outsider, they don't want it. Even if it was you and 10 Scottish people, I kind of get the feeling that they think this is some Canadian thing. I don't know if it's the same in Norway, but it's kind of, unless it's completely local, then it's kind of polluted by this idea that it's a foreign idea.
Yeah. There is an element of that, of course. Although I have to say, as a Canadian in Scotland, I never ran into that.
Yeah.
Because, if I was American, it might have been different,
Yeah.
actually. I mean, I've got a cousin in Vancouver. You wouldn't know him, would you? His name is John Stewart.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, Scots have such a strong Canadian connection. But your point is a valid one. And then for me, as a person trying to sell this idea, it's important that I can communicate the benefit. You know, and I can say, well, what do you want? Do you want development that is local and sustainable, or do you just want, do you want something to come in from outside, you know, and give it to you? There's a wonderful Billy Connolly. You know Billy Connolly, the Scottish comedian? He's really outrageous. He's great. There's a wonderful shtick where he's like in the Glasgow railway station busking on his guitar and, you know, begging for money. And he yells out, "Have any of the English bastards got any spare change?" He's like, "I don't care where you're from, if you're going to give me some money." But I know in fact, I mean, my message to these Scottish communities is you guys have to do it. It's up to you. It's your development. It's your ideas. It's your assets. It's your resources. If you don't want to do that, that's fine. But, you know, in a population that has been so disempowered by the way land is owned, you know, and the aristocracy and that's, as long as my name isn't Prince Charles, it's usually fine, you know. The thing about it is, too, the really useful way to think about things. Asset-based rural community development focuses on development as a process, not something that finishes, that starts and finishes. It's a process. You are never developing. You are always developing. It's always ongoing. And one of the problems with this bring in the caterpillars and build a big highway in the Sahara is that they expect development ends when the project ends. But it's not, that's not how, if you think that way, you're not going to have sustainable development. Asset-based rural community development focuses on communities gaining for themselves and building their own assets. It focuses on communities using their assets as part of the development process. And this is where I get into really a lot of trouble. It focuses on trusting people to develop themselves. You know, when I give presentations at university conferences, and I say, I always used to finish with that statement. We have to trust people to develop themselves. We have to respect people enough to think that they might know what they have to develop, they might know what's important, and they will have the skills amongst them all, or they can learn the skills to do it themselves. They might need me to come in and say, guess what, guys, you can do it yourself. But they don't need me to come in and do it for them. And people would jump all over me. What do you mean, trust people? Have you ever been to a community meeting? A bunch of amateurs, all they do is, yeah, you know, who's got the time for that? They don't know anything, you know? And I'm like, you're working in sustainable development. I can't believe you're asking me this question or telling me, you know, I'm wrong. That's the problem with development. People who think they're experts coming in from outside and telling people what to do. No, if we're going to come from outside, we encourage people to figure out what's the best thing for them to do themselves. Sustainable. Local empowerment. You know, nearly all of us live in countries where our government doesn't want us to develop for ourselves. They want us to do what they tell us. It's much easier for the politicians if we do what we're told. But have you ever had a government you can totally trust to develop for you? The way to do it is to do it yourself. And as people who focus on sustainable development, we have to respect, we have to trust the people in the community that they can do it. And I can guarantee you, and I have, and I will continue to give you example after example where people have done that and it has worked. That's why I'm a researcher. That's what I research. I go to these community people, the first people who started a community forest in Scotland, the pioneers, and I say to them, you guys are the experts. If you tell me what you had to do, I'll make a model that we can share with other communities so that they can do that too. I'm not the expert. The people on the ground are the experts. They're the ones who actually do it. Do I create a community forest? No. I work at a university. It's a really fundamental ethical approach to research and development. I am a facilitator. I'm not an expert. I am an expert facilitator. But I'm not an expert at, building community forests or sustainable food initiatives. I don't know the problems, the challenges, the things you need to do to respond, because I don't do it. But I go to people and I humbly ask them to share that with me so that I can write that up in such a way that I can share it with other people. Yeah. So, the first place that you have to start is communities have to define what is important. What is their priority? Is it, do I need a new village hall or do I need clean water? I'm coming with money for a new village hall. But they're like, we don't need a village hall. What we need is clean water. Or what we need is better education for our children. It has to start with the local people identifying what they need and what they have. Yeah. Now, asset-based rural community development. There are a lot of countries in which when you talk about community, you actually start immediately talking top-down development. The national organization of something or another organizes development, not the community. So I'd rather actually say rural entrepreneurs, because it could be private businesses, it could be public, it could be NGOs. When I say community, traditionally in this kind of advanced capitalist world, we see community as something different than entrepreneurial. But it's not. Hopefully by now already from everything I've said, I've convinced you that a community can be as entrepreneurial as an individual business person. But of course, it's easy to say and it's hard to do. How do we do it? We need a method, we need a system, we need a tool to recognize what assets are already present in the community and how to get them to contribute these assets to the development process. If we can do this, we can get the community can take ownership of development, because after all, they've contributed their own assets. The image, the model, the metaphor I like to use is sustainable development happens when a whole bunch of people sit around a table and every person has something to contribute. The outsiders, the local people, everybody has something to put into development. That's how you make sustainable development. It's not just the outsiders who have something, but the local people too. And they put what they own, their knowledge, their ways of working, their commitment of time, their vision. When that is combined with $100 million from the World Bank, then you can do something. Then we're talking sustainable development. Every person around the table has to contribute something of their own in order to have ownership of that development. Well, what do these peasants in Africa have? Well, it turns out they have assets. Now, they're not caterpillars, they're not heavy construction equipment, but it's knowledge. It's a willingness to work together, ways of working together, local history, local stories. And when you do this, what you get is a kind of development spiral where there's that first problem. We don't own any land in our community in Scotland. It's all owned by a lord who's a millionaire grocer from London, or the Swedish Tetra Pak family. I mean, the Tetra Pak, the Wahlbergs, own 85,000 hectares of Scotland. They're a lord. Right? What are we going to do? Well, let's buy 300 hectares of a forest. 300 hectares, what's that? Well, but at least it's ours. Okay. So we really struggle. And we find a way to buy 300 hectares of forest. And we work on it, and we make it nicer. And we get a little bit more money to make pathways, for people in wheelchairs, because there's always money for accessibility. And then we have a little project with the kids, and the kids build birdhouses and things. Let's bring more people come, and well, we've done that. Okay, what can we do now? Oh, we have this land. I bet if we were to apply for a little bit of money, we could then build a forest classroom, and then we could get paid for it. Yeah, okay, let's do that. We're already in the second loop of the spiral. Every time a community achieves a little bit of development, they are strengthened. And generally they take on something bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Remember what I said, development is a process, not a finite thing. So what we have is an upward spiral of development. Yeah? And with each subsequent development, the community has more skills, it has more capacity, it has more assets, because the process of developing, using their assets and development, increases the assets that the community has. It's just like any other kind of entrepreneurialism. I start a business, selling special food out of a truck. And I have some cash flow, and I can fix my truck. I built the truck myself, the first one. But, I got a little bad, I'd like to have 2 trucks. Okay, I'll pay somebody to build a much nicer truck. And it's exactly the same between communities and private enterprise. Every time you develop, you gain skills, you gain capacity. And you start taking on more and more things. And this is what communities do. And I got to tell you, this Abriakan in Scotland now employs 9 people full-time. And when I started in 1999 with them, they were all volunteers. They're all doing it for free. And they built up their capacity to generate more income, to invest more in the land, to generate more activity and income, to invest more in the land. And this spiral just kind of keeps going. The key thing about this model is that it is about what we have, not what we don't have. Yeah? And what's going to be more successful? No, I don't have anything. Will you give me something? Please, no, it's so terrible. Please help me. Or, hey, look at what this incredible stuff we have here. Can we do something with it? Would you like to work with us to do something? Are we going to be positive? Are we going to be negative? And as I said yesterday, I have colleagues, ex-bosses, who are professors who spent their entire life focusing on this. The French are classics of this. If you go to a European development conference, the French are going, but mountain areas are disadvantaged. They need special subsidies. And in Scotland, we're going, but mountain areas are the place where wants to go for recreation, there's great opportunities. No. The mountain areas, they must have special help. And guess who wins? The French. Or at least, this was the year of the mountain in 2004, yes. But as far as I'm concerned, if you want success, you've got to start with what do we have, not what do we not have. So this model was built from 1992, Forum for the Future came up with this 5 capitals model. Now again, this is a financial term. You know, if you have capital, you know, that means that you own something and you can borrow money against it. And they said, well, yeah, but it's not just money. These assets are capital to be invested in development. And if we're going to take it out of the bank and out of the financier's hands, we need to define these assets, these capitals, in a way that includes what is really there. And so this is the model, the 5 capitals. Here's the world. Natural capital. Inside that world is human beings. Social capital. That means between people. Human capital is person by person. I'll do this in much more detail in 1 minute. And then inside of that we have what they call manufactured capital. Roads, buildings, power lines, things that people build. And financial capital. And I'll keep coming back to this model of the 5 capitals. What is natural capital, right? Natural capital. Biodiversity. Landscape character. Soils. Can you grow things? Can you not grow things? Water. Is the water polluted? Is it California where there is no water? Is it Norway where there's too much water? Air and climate, minerals and others, and also non-renewables, things like waste. You know? In my region of Norway, the farmers produce 30% more cow nut than they are allowed to spread on the land because of the European Water Framework Directive. So what is everybody working on now? Bioenergy projects, attempting to use that cow shit to produce power. Yeah. What was a waste is now an asset for development. Natural capital. Of course, we could argue, we could say that the cow muck is manufactured. Whatever. As long as you see it as an asset for development. Human capital, right? Inside that natural world, is the human world. So let's talk about human. What is human capital? Well, this is, how do people have skills? Are they educated? The Western Isles of Scotland has historically produced the best educated young people in all of Britain. Which is why, where I grew up on the west coast of British Columbia in the fur trade thing, nearly all of the people who were the managers of the Hudson's Bay Fur Company came from 2 islands in the west of Scotland. Because this company knew these guys were hardworking, they were well educated. And as part of my historical geography masters, I had to annotate fur traders' journals from the 1850s, and every one of them was a MacLeod or a Mackenzie. The MacLeod's coming from Skye, and the Mackenzie's coming from Barra and Unst. Employment and skills base, really important. Education and training is the same thing. Health and well-being. Remember I said I did this community forest project in these housing estates in Glasgow? In Drumchapel, the average life expectancy of a man is 54 years. losing 10 years of productivity out of every man in that community. That's human capital. If the average life expectancy of the men is 75 years, that's an asset. You're capable of doing more. Are people sick? Are they healthy? That's all human capital. And it makes a difference in terms of the success or failure of development. Yeah? Human capital, that's individual people. Social capital is all of us together. Leaders, is there trust in the community? You know, I edited a book some years ago about the difficulty of a free market system in Eastern European socialist transition economies. And like in Eastern Germany, where nobody was willing to make a commitment because they didn't trust that it wouldn't get taken away from them, because that was their experience, the Stasi and all of those kind of stories. In the command economy, you'd start something and then the government would come in and take it. And there was real problems establishing a free market capitalist system after the change. Why? Because there was no trust in the leadership. That is a constraint against development. Whereas in that project of the 4 different areas, those communities that did have leaders that people trusted were able to work together much more effectively. Where you have leaders who are not going to steal all the money. Where you have leaders who are part of the community, not separate from it. Where there isn't corruption. Community cohesion in the sense of place. Is there a sense of I'm from Chesky Krumlov, and I want to make it a great place, and I'm really proud of being here, so I want to work together with my neighbors to make something of it. That is an asset for successful development. Stakeholder networks, like I said, those regions where there were large extended families, where people were happy to work together, or religious or other institutional reasons why people had experience coming together in large networks. They could transfer that skill into development. The first time I went to Croatia in 1996, I bought one of these travel packages, in England. And I flew to Dubrovnik, and somebody picked us up in a coach and dropped us off at an apartment that belonged to his cousin, where we stayed for 2 days. And then that cousin's nephew picked us up in a taxi and took us to a ferry boat and gave us the ticket. And we took the ferry to Korčula, where we met another cousin whose apartment we rented. And they were all part of the same extended family, because under the Croatian Soviet, the Yugoslavian system, it was extended family networks that allowed people to make a living in the face of that repressive Tito regime. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about networks and processes, yeah? Social capital, really important for bottom-up development. Not only do we need human, people who are well-educated and healthy, but we need experience of working together. And if you have that, that is an asset for successful development. Now, you of course can, if you don't have it, you can invest in building it. People can work together to improve this. Because every success you have contributes to having more capacity, more networks. You can do it, if you do it that way. Human capital, social capital, and here we are in cultural heritage land now. Manufactured capital. In other words, things that people have built. In the resource peripheries like Canada and Norway, the transportation systems were built for industrial mining, aluminum smelters, big industry, which is all collapsed. It's all gone away. It's now soon it'll be leaving there and going somewhere else. But those roads and those rails and those ports are now ways for tourists to come into the area and spend money. That manufactured asset, the transport network, is an incredibly important factor in 21st century development. I mean, look at the impact of Ryanair and EasyJet on Europe. As much as we love to hate them, coming into these small airports rather than into the big ones, you know, bringing 400,000 people a year into some small region that happens to be 50 kilometers away or 60 kilometers away from a big city has had an enormous impact on what people can develop in those small areas. That's all manufactured capital. The airport was there, but nobody was going. Now, that asset is being developed, it's being used. Transport infrastructure. Buildings and built heritage, well, I mean, we're sitting in it right now, yes? Processes, waste products, energy consumption, IT, I mean, rural broadband. I mean, that's a major enabler of enterprise, isn't it? You know, if a person in the remote rural area can participate in the digital economy, they don't have to be in the city, the center. So these things are all assets for development. You know, let's say I want to start, I want to start an organic seed supply business. You know, I live in a beautiful place with a really clean, natural environment, and I can grow potatoes without disease, so I'm growing seed potatoes, and they're organic, and I want to sell them all across Europe. If I don't have an internet connection, it's going to be pretty tough, isn't it? And if I don't have the roads for trucks to carry them away, it's going to be pretty tough. See how these things are assets? Of course they are. It's obvious, but we don't think that way usually when we think about it. And there's two things about this. One is that when you have these assets, you can take them for granted. And many people do when they develop things. But if you don't have them, you have to know they're there in order to fix them and develop them and make them work for you. That's why this model is so important. What do we have? What do we not have? Well, what do we need? Okay, we're going to have to build that. Yeah. It's simply really being aware. You know, of not taking for granted and then discovering, oh, I've got this great idea, but and everybody wants to come here, but there's no transportation. I can't get here. Ooh, damn. No. Guess that's not going to work. No? Oh, too bad, I've already borrowed, 300,000 euros. This model is here to help in that preparation before you get in that place. And finally, of course, financial capital. And this is important too, because there are more sources of money than governments and banks. You know, you can think out of the box. Conservation funding, like I said yesterday, European countries sign up to these commitments for things like biodiversity, carbon, capture, all this stuff. And they often sign up in such a way that if they don't achieve their target, they pay a penalty. So the government would rather pay you to develop something that helps contribute to achieving the target, it's cheaper, than paying the penalty at the end of the 5-year period when it turns out they haven't met the European Water Framework Directive. Only 38% of European countries have met the European Water Framework Directive. Now, 5 years after everybody was supposed to. And guess what? There's a cost for that. Yeah? So thinking about where the money comes from, I like to say, don't worry about the money. There's so many different sources of money if you think about it. What you have to have is a community and a great idea and a willingness to work, and you can find financing. It might be local, it might be national, it might be international. There's no reason why your local project can't access all of that. If you think, look, are creative, think outside the box. What we have to do is we have to link the assets, the capitals that we already have, with what we can see as the demand from potential customers. And we do that through, of course, using our imaginations and through working hard. Now, what do I mean? Okay, if we go back and we look at this 5 capitals model, and I'm going to ask you to do this after I finish talking. I'm going to ask you, for example, here we are, just a month. Can we do an assets analysis? In just per month, what is the natural capital? What is the human capital? What is the social capital? What is the manufactured capital? What is the financial capital? What capitals do we have for development? And that's what I'm going to ask you to do, because I think you realize it's not as hard as it looks when Rhys is just talking about it in front of the room. Now, I said this yesterday, right? That rural areas and urban areas are paired. If we think about modern life and what people want, with 59% of Europeans live in urban situations now, and it's growing every year. So what are the urban trends? What are the style? What do people want? What will they pay for? Well, here's just, I just sat down and wrote this, Everybody's mobile. Oh, that's good. That means I can come to Český Krumlov. Work-life balance. People are realizing there's more to life than just working hard, and they have leisure, formal leisure. Healthy. People are concerned with healthy living, both mental in terms of stress management and physical in terms of education and good food. More people are professional, as Margaret Thatcher liked to say. We're all middle class now. All of these things, people have more disposable income. People are much more interested in the city, in nature, usually than people living in the countryside, because they don't have it. All of these are opportunities for asset-based development for rural places. We need to connect what we have with the demand from consumers. So first we do the asset inventory, and we think, okay, how can we use these and develop them in order to get people to spend some of their money? Now here's an example. This is from a project I had some years ago now. In Britain and in Norway, in terms of agriculture, we have what they call the 80-20 rule. And that is that 80% of the farms in the UK only make 20% of the national agricultural income. And 20% of the farms make 80% of the national agricultural income. The majority of farms in Britain and Norway are too small to produce agri-industry commodities. Lucy was talking about that. Commodities, products, experiences, right? It's a real problem. In Norway, we have 2 farmers' unions. We have the Bondelag, which is the agricultural industry. Then we have the Småbrukarlag, the small farmers union. Guess which one has more members? The small farmers. Why are there 2? Because the conditions are so different between having a big, modern, commercial farm and a small family farm. This is a real problem. It's a real problem, not necessarily a problem for food supply, but it's about keeping people on the land. Because if you can't make a living from your small farm, what are you going to do? You're going to send your kids off to the city to get a real job, right? And eventually the land becomes empty of people, empty of enterprise. Only old people who've been there all their lives who retire, they're on their farm. The 80-20 rule. But in fact, small farms have all the assets needed for horse businesses. Now maybe the farm is up on a hillside and it's too steep to use big equipment, or maybe the land is too wet, to run your tractors over, or it's too far from the market, and there's no transport system. But in fact, that kind of land, the very land that makes these places uncompetitive, makes them competitive in other businesses. So what we have to do is we have to look at what the assets are and what the opportunities are and try and connect them together. And this project was looking at small farms and the horse economy. Now, there are some provisos here. It certainly helps to be near the city, to be in a peri-urban rural area if you're going to do a horse business. Because your market are people who are living in apartments who can't keep their horses in their apartments as much as they would love to. So there is that, if you're 45 minutes or less drive away, you can keep their horses. Right? Why? Well, look at this. Look at the natural capital of a small farm. On an existing small farm, you have pasture land, which is where you can turn out the horses. You have fields already enclosed in small fields. They're not good for combine harvesters, but they're good for keeping horses. Because if I keep 20 horses, I won't put all 20 horses in the same pasture. I'll probably have 2 or 3, because horses work in groups like that. And if I have, if 3 of the people who are keeping their horses on my land have alpha mares, who are always fighting about who's going to be the boss, and we've all got a competition next week that I paid £200 to participate in, and your horse kicked my horse, and now I can't go to the competition. No, I put it in another field. Right? These small farms are already set up for this kind of activity. They have natural water courses. One of the first things you do when you're building a big agri-farm is you drain it. Put in drains and you make the land dry so you can put big, huge tractors on it. But in fact, for horses, having this water is really important, so that they can drink when they want. Otherwise, you have to take the water to them. Yeah? Hedges. Yeah? Do you know what I mean by a hedge? The fences that are grown. In England, between 1999 and 2008, 105,000 kilometers of hedges were removed from farms so that you could have big equipment come in, combine harvesters. You can't do big farming when you've got all these lovely little fields surrounded by hedges. But it works fine for horses. And the same, you can't have trees in the middle of your field. You don't drive your tractor around 20 trees. But if you've got a horse in there and it's pitch down raining, guess where all the horses stand? Under the trees. Like this. Okay? These are pictures from my horses. This was Springy. Well, this is Springy as well, actually. And this is the farm where we kept her and the other 2 horses. It was a sheep farm, a 300-acre sheep farm, which she grew oats. I think she had 100 acres of oats. And the rest was natural pasture. And she kept 22 horses. And she got about 500 pounds, 400 pounds a month for each horse. She fed the horses on hay, which was from the oats, after the thrash. it would have been, if she would have had to buy in the hay, of course it would have been more expensive and less profitable. But she had the ability to do that. And you can see Springy here is walking along a small stream of water. And there she's like, yeah, I think I'll have a drink. You know, it's a hot summer day, I'm hiding under the trees and I want some water. Perfect for horses. Not good for combine harvesters. Manufactured capital. Look at them. That's what farms already have. Sheds, outhouses, barns to store the hay. Standing yards, you know, what they often they call a steading often in Britain. You know, around between all the buildings. Farmers already have machines and know how to use them. And even waste management. Here's Springy's stable, which was an old set of sheep buildings originally. The horses are pastured on this one. This is one of the fields the horses are pastured on. Here's the training ring, the outdoor ring. You know, there's the haylage sitting and fermenting away to be fed to the horses. And there is Mount Iona. And it's called Mount Iona because Iona was the person in charge of managing the muck heap. And every 6 months, this was cleaned right off to the ground level. And that's about 4 months old. It used to get even bigger. But my point is that the farmers already had a system for managing waste. And this is a big issue. I mean, you know, muck isn't always the best thing for the environment. You need to make sure that you don't have leachate water come out and, you know, that it's managed that way. And the farm already had these systems, and it was easy to convert them for horses. There's the hay barn, there's the equipment. Small farms have assets which are ideal for conversion to horse businesses. So you see what the kind of analysis I'm trying to do here is by using that fine capitalist model, you can look at what you already have, and you can ask, can I use it for a new development? Now, if I had one of these big Norwegian yarn farms, it was completely flat land, all the rocks were removed, the fields were huge. I didn't even have a barn on the land because, of course, I'm a modern farmer, so I rent fields from 4 different landowners, so I only have a building on one of them. Then I'd have to build everything from scratch to build a horse business. It wouldn't work. It'd be too expensive. But if we have the assets already, they can be converted much easier, much cheaper. And financial. Farmers are already used to borrowing money in the spring and paying it back when they harvest a crop. Farmers are already used to subsidies and paperwork and all of those things. A farm is business. They don't have to learn business skills in order to move into horses. They already have those skills. And that's an asset. That's a really important asset. And human capital, well, most farmers are already used to dealing with large animals. They have knowledge and experience. They have, practical skills in using heavy equipment, how you move the hay around. And I like to say farmers are actually land sculptors. The farmers around me, they go, I want to plant, I don't want any more potatoes, I want to grow this. So, I'm going to add a meter of soil to it. And they just start, and you come back 6 months later and it looks different. I mean, farmers see the land as something that is changeable. They have that knowledge, that skill. They know about how to be safe in, of course, one of the most dangerous industries. And the land, agricultural injuries. Farming has one of the highest rates of injury of any industry, usually in most countries. It's like right up there with forestry and mining and things like that. So, farmers know about these things, and these knowledge is an asset. Same with social capital. Most farmers, for a start, in terms of horses, they're already embedded in a community of people who do rural pursuits. They probably know people who have horses. They know who is doing it. They already have social capital around us, even if they don't exercise it in terms of horses. And it's also, access to information and advice. Farmers are used to extension. They're always being told what to do, in fact. So they have all of this social capital already, which can be converted into a horse business. So, farms, horses. There was a study done, I didn't do it, in 2009 in my area of Norway, which looked at exactly this thing. And they decided that if a farm was located within a 45-minute drive of a reasonable population, that you could keep people's horses, and that if you grew the food, you could make 5,000 kroner a month per horse. That's just 500 euros roughly. So if you keep 12 horses on your land, 10 horses on your land, okay, that's 50,000 euros, right? 10 times 500? No, 5,000 euros, sorry. That can mean the difference between a loss on a small farm and a small profit. I mean, nobody's going to get rich. You're not going to become a multimillionaire. But it can mean the difference between keeping the family on the land and having to abandon the farm. So it's very important for keeping the rural areas populated. Now this is just one example of an asset-based analysis and how what you already have can be converted to another kind of economic development. And I only do it because, of course, I'm into horses, but you could do the same analysis for farm tourism, for the production of local special food. What do we have? And then we can talk about what we can do with it. That's what this is all about. Many of in my experience, these are the kind of assets that have been developed for this kind of farm pluriactivity, farm multifunctionality. Local food, local history and local stories, like whiskey smuggling trails, local landscapes. There's a part of Highland Perthshire around Loch Tay in Aberfeldy, and it's absolutely beautiful. There's these estate farms with huge ash and oak trees and these very picturesque fields. And I did an asset project with the local community to identify, they were building a new community school campus, and they had made one room available to the community. Here you go, this is the Community Learning Center. Well, what are we going to learn? I mean, what's it going to focus on? And I got a contract to work out what might be inside that room. And as I interviewed people, everybody said, our problem is that the knowledge and skills that produce this beautiful landscape, nobody knows it hardly anymore. And when this generation of groundskeepers dies, there's no young people learning it. There's no way these young people can learn it. There's no access to this information. And so what they did is they put together a groundskeeping knowledge base to be taught to young people in this community campus. So what we did is we started this is an idea I stole from some Americans. Children's voices, elders' wisdom. So we got the secondary school pupils to go out and interview all of the landowners about all of the practices and knowledge that made the land And those students came back and we turned it into curriculum material to teach more young people how to get jobs taking care of the land. Local landscape, local culture products, local skills. These are the kind of assets that normally, or that I have seen being used a lot. And so when you think about your own communities and your own rural community development, this is not a bad place to start. But you will have other things as well that only you and your neighbors of your community know. And that's why you want a process that's bottom up, that's endogenous, in which local knowledge sets the agenda for development. I suppose, somebody could come in from outside and build a shopping mall, or the great American version is to put casinos on Indian reserves. Casinos are rural development in a large part of America. Yeah. Cheap cigarettes, cheap booze, on Indian reserves you don't pay federal tax. And gambling. That's development in a large part of rural America. I suppose if you want it, it's fine. And indeed, some of the native dams are actually very good at using that to then build other development. Like, okay, we've got money for our own school now. But really, I think it's better to start with the local knowledge, the local idea of what we need. Now, just a couple of no, I'm going to do this tomorrow, so I think, I will talk about this though. When I started doing this community woodland work, I was interviewing people and I was looking at the documents, and everybody in 1999 and 2000, these communities in Scotland, wanted to buy forest land, but they didn't have any money, or they didn't have enough money. So they were applying to the government for a grant or some help. And what they would do is they'd say, this forest, it's the forest of our ancestors' history. This forest is the forest of biodiversity. This forest is the forest of our children's future. They would claim what I call virtues for this land. This isn't just a forest. This is biodiversity. Biodiversity is good, right? You said you wanted biodiversity, Mr. Government, Ms. Government. We'll make biodiversity if you'll help us. They attached all these positive values to their project. They claimed these virtues. And so I, in fact, wrote a paper for the Forestry Commission called Virtuous Forests. And I listed the virtues that they were using successfully to raise money. I mean, some of them had public funding campaigns. They got little bits of money from, it's like Kickstarter or crowdsource funding, but there wasn't crowdsource funding on the internet at that time. Now, this was in 1999 and 2000. In 2010, I went back to some of these places to see how things were going. And what was really interesting was they were still going, but they were picking different virtues, because now all the money comes from health and well-being. So these are the forests of health and well-being. These are the forests of a healthy and happy Scotland, because they could get all this money to build walking paths for fitness groups. And the communities were very clever in identifying what virtues people were willing to give them money for. To develop their assets. They said, we have these assets, and these assets will deliver health and well-being if you'll help us build a path. Before, they said, we have these assets, and they're the assets of our identity and of Scottish political action against those bastards in England. Because there was the Scottish Land Fund. which was designed to allow people to buy land back in 1999. So they said, okay, we'll do that. But in 2010, that had been spent. Now there was money for health and well-being. So, okay, we can do that. If you're a community developer, you have to be pretty opportunistic. You have to see where the opportunities are and think in terms of that. Think in terms of how do our assets deliver what the wider society wants? Because if it does, they'll help us develop it. Which is rather clever. Yeah, perfect.
Do you think that's a good thing, what they were doing in Scotland there? Just
Yeah.
using like the buzzwords.
Well, that's the game. I mean, you could go there and you could say, we don't give a damn about any of that stuff. You can all bugger off, but you're not going to get access to part of what you need to develop. You know? It is just a game. It is just a dance. It's not a matter of lying. I mean, it's not lying. You know, you're saying, look, this is for real. You know, and I like in the running around like they own the place. These kids, you know, felt like that a Bahia can belong to them in a way that the previous generation of kids felt that it didn't, and they just had to leave. I mean, you can't lie, you know, you can't, but the system is amenable to this kind of, I mean, you could be cynical and call it manipulation, or you could say vision. I think it has always been this. Especially, however, in this neoliberal economy, where you have to compete with other communities. You don't get anything just because you're there. You get it because you're able to convince others that you have something that they want. Okay. Asset-based rural community development. I think everybody's falling asleep, so I think we need 5 minutes of fresh air. And then I'd like you to come back, and we have some rolls of big paper and some pens, right? And I'm just going to be completely arbitrary and go, I'll put the line right here. You guys are group 1, you guys are group 2, you guys are group 3, and this is group 4. Okay? And when you come back, I'll give you something to do an asset analysis. Okay.
That'd be great.
Jo, dej vám to
Coffee.